What happens when a man who has mastered silence finally runs out of strength to hold it in? On a quiet filming set, far from red carpets and rehearsed smiles, Shukai reached a breaking point. The cameras were not meant to capture a confession. Yet, in a moment that felt heavier than any scripted line, his voice cracked, his composure slipped, and one name escaped his lips: Tan Songyun. This was not spectacle. It was something rarer and far more human. Silence is often mistaken for calm, but in truth, it is usually endurance. For someone like Shukai, silence had become a professional skill, honed through years of public scrutiny, expectation, and restraint. He learned when to speak, when to smile, and, more importantly, when not to reveal what weighed on him most. Over time, that silence stopped being protective and became cumulative. On that day, on set, nothing dramatic happened at first. There was no argument, no confrontation, no sudden crisis. And that is precisely why the moment mattered. Emotional limits are rarely breached by explosions. They are crossed quietly, when the mind has been holding the door shut for too long, and the body decides it cannot anymore. The tears were not a loss of control. They were a release, a long-delayed exhale after years of measured breathing. In that brief lapse, the silence that had once shielded him finally gave way to honesty, unpolished, unfiltered, and deeply human. What made the moment powerful was not its volume, but its inevitability. Viewers sensed that this was not something newly felt, but something long carried. Silence, after all, does not erase emotion, it stores it. And when it can no longer hold, what emerges is not weakness, but truth. Names are rarely just sounds. They are containers of memory, safety, and meaning. When a name surfaces in an unguarded moment, it is usually because the mind has stopped filtering and the heart has taken over. That is why the name Tan Songyun carried such weight when it was spoken. This was not a declaration crafted for an audience. It felt instinctive, almost reflexive, like reaching for something familiar in the dark. In moments of emotional vulnerability, people do not choose symbols or explanations. They choose anchors. A name, in that sense, becomes shorthand for everything words cannot easily express: comfort, trust, understanding, and presence. What resonated with viewers was not speculation about meaning, but recognition of the impulse itself. Many people have experienced that moment when composure dissolves and only one thought remains: the person who represents calm amid chaos. Saying a name aloud can be an act of grounding, a way to steady oneself when emotions threaten to overwhelm. The power of that moment lay in its simplicity. No context was given, no explanation demanded. And because of that, audiences were free to project their own understanding onto it. The name mattered because it was not explained. It simply appeared, honest, unguarded, and unprotected by narrative. That authenticity is what lingered. Not all strength announces itself. Some forms of resilience operate quietly, away from applause and recognition. In this story, what moved audiences most was the presence of a steady, unobtrusive kind of support, one that does not rush forward or ask to be acknowledged. This form of strength does not correct, interrupt, or dramatize. It listens. It waits. It stays. In high-pressure environments like filming sets, where exhaustion is normalized and emotional fatigue often goes unnoticed, such steadiness can become a private refuge. It allows space for vulnerability without demanding explanation. What makes this kind of strength compelling is its restraint. It does not insist on being seen as heroic. Instead, it creates conditions where others feel safe enough to be honest. That safety is not loud, it is consistent. It does not push for resolution only presence. Audiences responded to this idea because it reflects a longing many people share: the wish to be supported without being managed, to be understood without being exposed. In a world that often equates care with control, this quieter form of emotional reliability feels rare. The narrative resonated not because it promised romance or certainty, but because it honored emotional labor that usually remains invisible. Strength here was not about fixing anything. It was about holding space until someone else was ready to breathe again. Composure is often praised as professionalism, maturity, or strength, yet it comes at a cost that is rarely discussed. For public figures, composure becomes more than a habit. It becomes an obligation. Feelings are delayed, managed, or repackaged until they are deemed acceptable for public view, if they are allowed at all. The moment that unfolded on set offered a rare glimpse of what happens when composure reaches its limit. It was not a rejection of responsibility, but evidence of how long responsibility had been carried. Emotional control, when maintained indefinitely, does not disappear. It accumulates. What viewers sensed was not recklessness, but fatigue. The fatigue of constantly being aware, constantly adjusting, constantly protecting an image that leaves little room for personal truth. In that brief lapse, composure loosened its grip, and something more honest surfaced. This struck a chord, because many people live similarly composed lives, even without fame. They manage emotions at work, in families, in public spaces, saving authenticity for moments when they are alone. Seeing composure falter did not diminish respect. It deepened it. The cost of composure is not failure. It is delay. And when emotion finally arrives, it often carries the weight of everything postponed. This moment stayed with audiences precisely because it refused to resolve itself. There was no statement to clarify intent, no narrative closure to guide interpretation. Instead, viewers were left with a fragment, raw, unfinished, and emotionally coherent. In a digital culture that rewards immediacy and explanation, ambiguity feels unsettling. Yet, it is also what makes moments feel real. Life rarely provides neat conclusions, especially when it comes to emotion. By ending without answers, the moment mirrored lived experience rather than performance. People return to it not to confirm facts, but to revisit a feeling. The stillness, the pause, the sense that something deeply personal had briefly surfaced before retreating again. That emotional residue invited reflection rather than judgment. What endured was not the question of what it meant, but why it mattered. It mattered because it showed restraint, breaking without spectacle, because it allowed vulnerability without exploitation, because it reminded viewers that even within curated worlds, authenticity can slip through unexpectedly. Ultimately, the moment stayed because it felt human. And human moments do not conclude cleanly. They echo. In a world that rewards perfection, this moment reminded us that honesty can be the bravest performance of all. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't declared. They slip out when the heart finally speaks for itself. If this story moved you, and you appreciate thoughtful, human-centered storytelling from the world of entertainment, please consider subscribing to LVT Showbiz. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for staying curious. We'll see you in the next story.